So first of all, hello everyone, and well, I'm honoured to be here and to be answering these questions. I'm honoured that so many people are interested, have shown interest in the book since its release a year and a half ago. I suppose that was a large part of the motivation for writing the book. The feeling that this was an incomplete story, certainly in the sense that it had been told in an incomplete way, or the facts had been presented in an incomplete way in the English-speaking media. I certainly knew there'd been a lot more coverage in Germany, and you know, I'd lived with this issue of doping and doping in cycling, rampant doping in cycling for the first 15 years, I suppose, of my career covering the sport. And as time had gone by, my approach to it had been less and less a moralistic one, and certainly not a pontificating one. My approach, or my belief, was that one needed to lay out the facts, as many facts as possible, and then leave people to make their own minds up. And I felt that with Jan Ullrich, the story had been told in a way, in an incomplete way, that was really designed to railroad people towards a negative judgment, in the same way that people had negatively judged, well, Lance Armstrong was the primary sort of figurehead, the emblematic figure of that generation, and people had been sort of encouraged and railroaded towards a very negative moral judgment of him, partly because of the way he behaved, more than maybe, or behaved certainly towards his peers, more than because of the original sin of having doped, which was an original sin, or a moral sin, as far as a lot of people were concerned, that was common to a lot of members of that generation. So I wanted to tell that story. I wanted people to understand how unique the context was in Germany, as against other places where cyclists had been tried publicly, tried by media, or tried literally in a legal sense. And again, that was part of presenting the facts as I saw them, as I could best understand them, while withholding, or not even really feeling confident in my own personal moral judgment. Still not even today, I would suggest. It's certainly not a big part of my motivation, or wasn't a big part of my motivation for writing this book. Well, I think Jan Ullrich was certainly faced with sort of Hobson's choice, kind of dope or be damned, and in the publicity he's done in anticipation of a documentary that's just come out on Amazon Prime called Der Gejagte, The Hunted, which, well, has given Jan Ullrich the opportunity to finally sort of come clean and give a comprehensive confession. He's talked about this. He's talked about how, in his eyes, doping was mainly a way of evening things up, being able to compete on a level playing field, and feeling straight away when he turned professional in 1995 that he couldn't compete on a level playing field without doping. In his case, and I suppose in the case of a lot of professional cyclists, you have to think about the question of identity and ego. And with Ullrich, he was someone who'd grown up in East Germany, and his whole identity as a 17, 18-year-old, that's the point at which the Berlin Wall came down for him. His identity had been built around being the best sportsman in his year group and in his sports school in Berlin. And in East Germany, there were also very material, tangible benefits that came with that, and there was a whole sort of path in life that was completely different to that of one's countrymen. sports stars in East Germany were referred to and have been referred to by sports historians as diplomats in tracksuits. They played, well, there was prestige and there were material gains, but there was also the sense of being a figurehead for one's country, literally almost like a diplomat. So Jan Ullrich was someone who grew up in a broken home. His father had left the family when he was 6 or 7. He never really received too much affirmation outside of the sporting realm. So he then turned professional, having won the World Amateur Championships in 1993, and he came into this world where all of a sudden, having sort of been confident at every other previous stage that his talent would continue to procure him that affirmation, that love, if you want, solidify his identity, self-identity, he came to realize, was presented with the reality that the only way for that to continue was through doping. There was absolutely no way to be the best without doping. One could survive in professional cycling, possibly without doping, but not be competitive at the highest level. And I think that's an explanation, not an excuse, for why he doped. And I think he still probably needs to see it as an explanation, not an excuse. That said, I think it certainly should maybe make us slightly more sympathetic or understanding, empathetic of the choice he ultimately made. But legally, there is no doubt that doping, taking anything that's on the ban list or using a banned method, that is doping. It's not about getting caught or not getting caught, it's about the act of cheating, which is what he did. Well, yes, I do feel there's a human side to doping excesses, particularly in a generation which, as I've already said, was really gripped by this plague of doping, which it tore through professional cycling and completely sort of dominated the narrative in professional cycling for 15 years or so. Negative or positive, I feel that, again, we're sort of getting into the realm of moral judgments on people. I sought as much as possible to avoid that, simply because I don't really feel it myself. I don't feel strongly that there necessarily needs to be a moral judgment. Maybe that's the journalist in me, and simply the sort of overriding desire to lay out the facts, lay out as many facts as possible. And in this particular book, that was always going to be difficult, because as soon as I embarked on this project in 2015, I knew that there were a lot of people who had not wanted to delve much deeper into this issue. A lot of the riders involved, a lot of the coaches involved, the doctors involved had sort of exiled themselves in this kind of pact of silence, for fear, in some cases, of incriminating themselves, for fear of incriminating other people, for fear with regard to Jan Ullrich of his fragility, his mental fragility. So that I knew that it would be difficult to get an absolutely comprehensive series of eyewitnesses accounts from everyone. However, I sought to speak to as many people as possible. I've certainly asked, I requested interviews from pretty much everyone that I thought was relevant. Didn't get all of them, but in most cases, I think I probably got 95% of the interviews that I wanted, and that was able to give what I think is a pretty comprehensive and textured view of how things were, and maybe why people took the choices that they took. And based on that composite composite picture. I think people can conform their own moral judgments, positive or negative, as they see fit. I think I've already explained some of my motivation to focus on Jan Ullrich was this sense that the story hadn't been fully told, which it had been with other, or to a greater extent with other athletes of that generation. I felt that they had maybe been given more comprehensive coverage, or in the case of Armstrong, it had played out in a more public way, and there wasn't the same need to maybe shine a light on certain aspects of the story. Other people had already done that, for example David Walsh with Lance Armstrong and other journalists. So Ullrich was someone who had always sort of captivated me from the moment, which was a very powerful moment for me. I write about it in the book, in the preface of the book, when he came onto the scene in 1997, and well, this stunning emergence in one stage, particularly in 1997, when he won in such a way that people were convinced that he was going to rewrite the destiny of professional cycling. I write in the book, in the same way that Tiger Woods in the same year, in 1997, had won the US Masters, and everyone was convinced that this was going to change the landscape of professional golf. That was the power, that was the sort of magnitude of that moment in professional cycling. It never happened. He won that Tour de France, but it never happened. And I think these figures, whether it's in music or whether it's in sport, that offer this tantalizing glimpse of genius or what might become, only to then disappear from the scene or fail to ever recreate that. I think they fascinate us. In music, often, unfortunately, it's artists who die young or who lose themselves to drugs, alcohol, other vices. With Ullrich, those vices they came into his life later, but as far as his career was concerned, he lost, or that narrative was lost, that sort of that kind of continuation of how we thought his career was going to go, that was lost because of his own waywardness, but also because Armstrong came on the scene, and it just didn't happen. But that sort of tantalizing first glimpse remained fascinating, and I think it's one of the reasons why people continue to be fascinated by Ullrich. In his case, there were lots of different layers to the story that I wanted to tell, and it's not really a book just about Jan Ullrich. It's a book about Germany. It's a book about, to a certain extent, about modern German history. It's a book about what happened to professional cycling over 20 years. It's a book about what happened to professional cycling in Germany, which sort of grew from nothing, and it boomed and it exploded, and then it collapsed to nothing. So it wasn't just the desire to write about a sort of perennial bridesmaid or someone who was a loser. I mean, Jan Ullrich still had a fantastic career in terms of what he won, obviously tarnished, but he still had a fantastic career. It was a sort of desire to latch onto and explore, and again provide this composite perspective of a lot of different intermingling, interweaved factors and storylines that were playing out at that time. I took 7 years to write the book. That was for a series of reasons. I would say, first of all, the main reason, certainly, that, well, from 2015 to 2018, the book was already taking longer than it should have taken. The main reason for that was I was struggling personally I struggled hugely with confidence, and one could say a writer's kind of block issue since I'd started working as a journalist in, well, 15 years before that. It was more serious than that, in the sense that it was almost a complete sort of physiological block and breakdown, and panic and anxiety when I had to write, and which had really sort of sabotaged my career as a journalist, and you know, that was heightened and increased whenever a project meant more to me, or meant a lot to me, and this did mean a lot to me. And you know, it wasn't a sort of conventional perfectionism where someone could say, well, you know, you've written a first draft and it's fine, just send it in. It was literally sort of staring at a screen for hours on end and not being able to write a single sentence, and my brain not feeling as though it worked at all, and yeah, just a total lack of confidence. At the same time, you know, the investigative work for the book, that was very much, well, that was happening. I was doing that, and I was doing it, I think, relatively, you know, well, in the sense that, you know, in those first 3 years, I'd interviewed most of the people that I wanted to interview. I'd got great interviews, I'd got great material, and it was simply the writing that I just couldn't get on top of, and that was jeopardizing the book. I remained very much committed to it. Fortunately, I had a publisher who was very patient, but by 2018 I'd got a reasonable amount done. Maybe 2/3 of the book was in actual fact written, or maybe more than that, 3/4 of the book was written. However, parallel to that, there was the issue of Ullrich's own life and his own problems. At that point in 2018, he had this awful meltdown, and that created questions also in my mind about whether this was morally sort of justifiable to write this book, because it could potentially have contributed, if it had come out a year later, which it could have done at that point. It could have come out in 2019, whether it could potentially have imperiled, worsened his problems, his very fragile psychological state at that point. And yeah, I fought a lot with this. There was also the fact that I needed to remain faithful to that original goal, that original sort of mission of telling the story comprehensively, and knowing what was going on, knowing what had happened. And obviously, at that point in time, 2018, when he was having all of those problems, as difficult as it had been before that to access certain members of his entourage and to convince them to give me interviews, it became even more difficult, because everyone was very, very nervous about his mental health and where his life was at that moment. So I reached a bit of an impasse. No one would really tell me what was going on, or very few people would go on the record about what was actually going on, and it became very, very difficult to move forward. And fortunately, over the next couple of years, he got his life back on track to a certain extent, not without relapses, knockbacks, and moments when things seemed to be going very wrong again. But slowly he came back to life, and slowly I was also able to, well, sort of see a way forward whereby I could take precautions with a view to not doing anything that was going to worsen his plight. So, for example, decide that I shouldn't allow the book to be translated in Germany, although there was a publisher who was a big publisher who was very interested and made us a good offer. I decided that the book shouldn't come out in Germany, simply because I wouldn't have control over the way it was promoted. Things might be taken out of context. The German media, or the sections of the German media that already felt quite negatively towards Ullrich, might take certain parts of the book, quotes, use them out of context, and just sort of light another match, and another fire could break out. And I then, having originally decided that I was going to be not sympathetic necessarily, but sensitive, I would be then impotent, and I would be able to do nothing to stop all of this happening. So that was one precaution I took. I thought a lot about the parts of the book that I'd already written, and thought about ways that they could inflame the situation, and I maybe made changes, tweaks, didn't distort anything, always tried to tell the whole truth, but I was more conscious of how certain things could impact him. And slowly I started to move towards a point where I thought that the book was honest, intellectually honest, but also very sensitive as well. And in the meantime, also spoke to people who were close to Jan now, and was happy enough or satisfied in my own mind that it wasn't irresponsible to go forward with the book. And hence, finally, after 7 years, I was able to finish it. I think doping will always happen, cheating will always happen. I think, honestly, and maybe this is something I didn't write enough about in the book. To be honest, the book was already too long. There were already too many things in there that I was trying to include. But maybe I didn't write enough or communicate clearly enough how I think cycling has succeeded in changing its culture, which is not to say that it has eradicated doping or will ever eradicate doping, but thanks to several individuals, or lots of individuals, and also due to the fact that I think everyone involved in cycling realised that it could not go on the way it was in about 2008, 2009. The oil tanker did start to turn around, and there was a conscious effort to start to change things. And I believe, having worked in the sport, and obviously working at close proximity to the people involved over the last 10 years or so, I do believe that particularly the peer pressure that exists in cycling, having once worked in favour of people cheating and breaking the rules, I do believe that over time it has moved in the other direction, and that the overwhelming peer pressure that exists in professional cycling now, from between riders, from team managers towards riders, from the media towards riders, it works in favour of people not cheating. There's also definitely a practical element to this, and in the sense that if a product exists, or if a product becomes available that is very, very difficult to test for, and is very, very effective, and is very, very safe, if that happens at any point in the next 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, it's not inconceivable that we go back to a situation that we had in the 90s and 2000s, where a large, certainly a majority of riders, I think, in the 90s are cheating. Obviously we hope that doesn't happen, and I think that positive culture that I think has been created now would take quite a lot of bad faith actors to sort of undermine that, and it would take time for that to be undermined, but it could be undermined again, and I think our guard has to be up against that. But at the moment, I don't believe such a product or such a method exists, certainly not one that we're aware of, and consequently, because of the culture that exists now, and because practically speaking there is no really easy way, I don't think, to cheat and do it consistently over time and not get caught, I think cycling is in a pretty good place. Well, I think I've answered this question to an extent. It caused me immense anxiety, a huge anxiety for a long time, for several reasons. Anxiety that, as I've already explained, I was able to sort of mitigate to a certain degree by constantly having Jan Ullrich, the person, the human, at the forefront of my thoughts, and trying as much as possible to empathise and, if not sympathise, understand him and understand how such a book might affect him. Having lived in that way, sort of empathising with him and worrying about the book and how it would come out and what people would think about it. In the end, 2 years on, I suppose if I am proud of anything in the book or about the book, it's the way that I did that, the way that I went about it, the way that I was so sensitive, while at the same time being intellectually honest and not distorting any reality and not leaving out facts, verifiable facts. I think I presented pretty much all of the facts that were available to me at the time, and you know, I've sort of been comforted in this recently by the documentary that I referred to earlier coming out, Jan Ullrich giving a comprehensive confession, and him also talking about how for himself laying out the facts has been cathartic, and I, by sort of proxy or vicariously, I hope that would be the case, that you know, not that my book would play any great role in him sort of redeeming himself or recovering or feeling better about his life, but I've always I certainly believe now that, you know, as I think I write in the book, shame can't survive the light, and in a way I sort of hope to defuse some of the shame that he felt by presenting all of those facts and just saying, look, this is what happened in Jan Ullrich's career, this is what happened in the sport at the time. It's bad, it was bad, but it's not mortal, it's not you know, no one should feel, I don't want to be glib about this, I was going to say no one should feel suicidal about this, but you know, no reality is as bad as the sort of festering, putrid version of that reality that people kind of lock inside their heads and think they can't share with anyone. That reality laid out for everyone to look at and everyone to, again, form their own moral judgments about, is a much more palatable one. And I think Jan Ullrich's kind of discovered, since he's done that, there's probably more humanity in the world and there's more sympathy than he imagined. I hope that's the case. It is quite difficult. It's difficult just in a mundane way, in the sense that sometimes there are things you like to fact check simply, and very often the only person who can fact check them or can verify them is the protagonist, and in this case that wasn't available to me. It's also obviously liberating not to have the collaboration of the subject of the book, in the sense that, well, it's just from a technical point of view of writing. With this book, for example, if I had done one 3 or 4 hour Jan Ullrich interview, it would be kind of difficult to know how to use that, because we would have covered various different parts of his career. The book proceeds mainly chronologically. Do you introduce those contributions from Ullrich, or do you sort of sprinkle them throughout the narrative, or are they saved for the end? If I had been able to speak to him, in my mind, that's probably how I would have used an interview. I would have used all of the other material and then kind of introduced him at the end, the last chapter. What I sort of hoped would happen was that I would be able to meet him in his currently recovered state, and be able to give a bit of a sort of happy ending to the book, and simply, rather than necessarily want to extract any particular answer from him, just be able to describe the meeting at the end. I came pretty close to being able to do that, in the sense that I went to where he's living now, or when I finished writing the book, I met with the person who's sort of been taking care of him over the last couple of years, and even physically he was in the village that day where we were, and so you do almost feel his presence, I sort of think and hope, at the end of the book, the presence of this guy who is trying to again find his way back to life, and that to me in the end was pretty satisfactory, I think. But generally speaking, it is very difficult, and as I said before, this was an incredibly sensitive operation from day one. From 2015, there were certain individuals that I really had to speak to, and these individuals had not given any interviews for years and years. Armstrong, for example, I think he was the first interview I requested, and he was essential. He was absolutely essential. He was essential for sort of commercial reasons, in the sense that Ullrich is less famous than Lance Armstrong, and this was an English-speaking publisher, and the main, the sort of star name from that era was Armstrong. Their rivalry was a key reason why a book was being commissioned on Ullrich, so I had to speak to Lance Armstrong. And fortunately, I was able to do that. And there were others: Rudy Pevenage, Walter Godefroot, these director sportifs that had worked with Ullrich for a long time. Again, they hadn't spoken to anyone for years. And once 3 or 4 of those sort of non-negotiables, those essentials, were in the bag, and that happened early, sort of 2015-16, I knew that I would have enough to be able to write the book without Jan Ullrich.